This Parsha class is brought to you by IntentionalJew.com, the home of the Intentional Jew Podcast Network.
Okay, it's amazing that we had a full week of learning. I think the first full week in a very long time, and really accomplished a lot. I think in this, really, we spent almost all of our time on one Mishnah, but really accomplished a lot in that one Mishnah. This week's Parsha is Parshas Chayei, which is the Parsha where we talk about the death of Sarah. In the beginning of the Parsha, we establish our stronghold and our connection to the city of Chevron. So I want to talk a little bit about the city of Chevron and the place that it plays inside of Jewish life. I think that there's a very beautiful thing will emerge from this understanding. The first question that we have to ask is that why Chevron? Why is that such an eternal city? Why is it something that's so critical to us? Forgetting the fact, notwithstanding the fact that we bought it and we spent money on it, nevertheless, it wants us to wonder why the power of Chevron, why the importance of Chevron. Why did Dovid Hamlechs, when he began his kingdom, why did his kingdom need to begin in Chevron? He ruled first in Chevron and then moved his palace and his kingdom to Yerushalayim. Why was it first? Why did it begin? Did it have to begin in Chevron? This ma'ara, this cave where the patriarchs are buried, so we know that Avraham Avinu was exposed to that for the first time on the day that the three angels came to visit him. That when he was preparing food, he was running after a bucker, he was running after a cattle, he was running after an animal, and he ended up running into a cave. And when he got into the cave, he saw two bodies that were there that looked partially dead, partially alive, and he understood that he was there in the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, in the cave in the double cave, which we'll talk about in a minute, but that he was there in that place that eventually was going to be his burial place, was going to be his wife's burial place. And he understood that in this place, this was the Pesach, this was the opening of Gan Eden, of the Garden of Eden. Why Dafka on the day that he was going to get the promise about children and that the angels were going to tell him that the time had come and that he was in fact going to have children? Why Dafka on that day? Is that the day that he was exposed and opened up to the city of Chevron and to the Ma'aras HaMachpelah? Also, we have to wonder, why is it called Ma'aras HaMachpelah? The cave of the Machpelah really means the double cave. What's the double of the double cave? We know that in temple times, there were no sacrifices that would be offered in the morning, none of the daily sacrifices and none of the other sacrifices that would be offered until they could ascertain that Heir Pnei Kol HaMizrach Ad Chevron, that the whole eastern sky was lit all the way up until Chevron. What was the necessity to have to make that statement, to have to wait until the moment that the sky was light enough that it would technically, theoretically have reached Chevron? Why does Chevron figure in the temple service, in the avoda that we do every day? Furthermore, when Calev, at the time of the spies, went to daven, he didn't go to the place of where the temple was going to be built in the future, but he went to the Ma'aras HaMachpelah, he went to Chevron, and he davened to God that he should give him the strength to be able to fight against the Meraglim, to be able to withstand and to counteract the dangerous thing that the Meraglim, the spies, were going to do. And he asked for divine assistance, and he went dafka to the place of Chevron. Why was it necessary for him to daven in Chevron? Why not go to Yerushalayim? Why not go to Mount Moriah, to the place where miracles have already happened in the past, and in the place which was going to be the Shar Shamayim, which was going to be the gateway to heaven? So we know that the city of Chevron, the city of our forefathers, is called Chevron, which means chibur. The word chibur means to attach. Classically, the way we understand it is that the chibur is between, it's the makom achibur, the place of attachment between heaven and earth. As it is, we know that it's there that the Pesach to Gan Eden, the Pesach to the Garden of Eden, to eternity, is there in the city of Chevron. And therefore it's a chibur, it's an attachment of those two worlds. It's an attachment of this world and the world of eternity. But there's another chibur, another attachment. The attachment is between Chevron and Yerushalayim. And the name of the city, Chevron, chibur, attachment, reflects and alludes to that bond. Because maybe that could also explain why it's called Ma'aras HaMachpelah, why it's called the double cave, which our rabbis classically explain as meaning a double cave because the doubles are buried there, all the pairs are buried there. Adam and Chavra, Avram and Sarah, Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov and Leah. All the doubles are buried there. Therefore, it's Ma'aras HaMachpelah, it's the cave of the doubles, the cave of the pairs. Or our rabbis given in explanation, the reason why it's called a Ma'aras HaMachpelah, because it's a double cave. It's a cave within a cave. But that Machpelah could also be referring, the doubleness of it, could be referring to the coupling of Chevron and Yerushalayim. And that's why they would wait in the morning to be able to give that testimony, Her Pnei Kol Mizrach Ad Shebechevron, that the eastern sky has become a light until Chevron, because the avodah in the Beis HaMikdash could only take place if there was a partnership with Chevron. Both of them had to be plugged in and ready to go in order for the sacrifices to happen. And that's the Chevron, the chibur, the attachment. It's the attachment between Yerushalayim and Chevron. But what exactly is that partnership? What did each one of them contribute? What did Chevron have that Yerushalayim didn't, and what did Yerushalayim represent that Chevron didn't? We know that in our avodas Hashem, in our service of God, we have really two avenues. We have what's called avodas pnim. We have the internal side. We have those mitzvahs that are there to develop our internal side, our eternal side, to develop our character, to develop our soul, to develop our connection, our internal and eternal connection with God. And then we have the avodas chutz. We have the external things. We have the actions. We have the words. We have the things that create this bond between us and God. In fact, these two avenues of pnim and chutz, of internal and external connections, is in fact reflected in our imahos, in Rachel and Leah, who one was, her domain was avodas pnim, and one's domain was avodas chutz. And each one of them had their role, chutz and pnim, which is why they needed two husbands. One of them needed Yaakov and one of them needed Esav, so that they could complement them on this task of developing the eternal and developing the external. But when Esav abdicated the throne, when Esav said, I don't want a part of this, now Yaakov Avinu had to marry both of them and take on that dual role as Yaakov and Yisrael, that dual role of external and internal. And it manifested itself in their children, in the leadership of their children, in Yehuda and Yosef. One of them responsible for the avodas chutz, and one of them responsible for the avodas pnim. And that's why in the future there's going to be two Mashiachim. There's going to be Mashiach ben Yosef, and there's going to be Mashiach ben Dovid. One of them is going to pave the way for an eternal internal connection to God, and one for the external connection to God. The Beis HaMikdash was built in a city. It wasn't built in a field. It wasn't built outside. It was built in a city. A city is called an ear. An ear is or. It is awake. It's a place of hustle and bustle. It's a place of connection between people. It's a place where it's alive. There are things going on. There were Asara Nisim, there were 10 miracles that happened every single day in the Beis HaMikdash to attest to the presence of Hashem. And Yerushalayim represented the outward manifestation of this relationship to God. Yerushalayim was a place that signified an easily discernible Kedusha. You could see it 10 different places every single day. You see it in the miracles that happened, in the pillar of smoke that arose from the altar all the way to the sky, 365 days a year, 24 hours a day. No matter if there was wind, no matter if there was rain, no matter what the weather was, that pillar of smoke stayed straight and strong and was the indication, was the clear manifestation of an external relationship with God. It was a clear indication that God was there. Yerushalayim, its very name, Yerushalayim, Hashem Yira, that it's a place where you can see God, where you can feel the manifestation of God, and it's Shalom, and it brings you shleimus, it brings you wholeness. Yerushalayim represented the outward manifestation of our relationship with God, and it signified an easily discernible Kedusha. The Kedusha of Chevron, though, was a very different Kedusha. The Kedusha of Chevron wasn't readily apparent. There is a difficult beauty in the hills of Chevron, the mountainous, rocky hills of Chevron. The Avos were buried in the Ma'aras Machpelah, in that cave, which was a cave inside of a cave, which was a place of absolute concealment. The Kedusha of Yerushalayim, that's clear. That's consistent, that's apparent. The Kedusha of Chevron is hidden and discreet. The Kedusha of Yerushalayim represents the Avodas Chutz, represents the external relationship with God. And the Kedusha of Chevron represents the Avodas Pnim, the internal, eternal relationship with God. We're taught this concept by Rabbi Chanina ben Trajan. When Rabbi Chanina ben Trajan was one of the 10 martyrs, when he was taken out to be killed, he was wrapped up in a Sefer Torah. And as he was being burnt inside of that Sefer Torah, his students asked him, Rabbi, what do you see? And he said, I see the parchment is burning, but the osios parchos ba'avir, but the letters are flying to the air. And what he was telling us is that external Kedusha can be destroyed. The parchment can be destroyed. It can be removed. It can be burnt. It can be wiped out. If we're not worthy, that external Kedusha can go. Like the Sefer Torah and like the Beis HaMikdash. But the Kedushas HaPnim, the internal bond, the eternal connection to God, that can never be obliterated. Those osios aparchos ba'avir, the soul of the Torah and the soul of the Jew, can never be destroyed. Even when we no longer have the avodas chutz, when we no longer have this external service, we no longer have sacrifices, we no longer have the service inside of the temple, we no longer have karbanos, but we still have avodah shebelev, we still have the internal service, we still have the service of the heart, we have tefillah, which, like the remains of our avos, the remains of our forefathers, endures forever. Even though because of our sins, our temple was destroyed, we can forfeit the privilege of the outward manifestation of Kedusha, but we still retain this inner, inherent Kedusha. And that's the chibur. That's the attachment, the eternal attachment to God himself, which is manifest in the city of the Avos, in the city of our forefathers. The word chibur, if you anagram those letters, it also spells charav, churban, destruction. Because even when there is a churban, even when there is a destruction of the external relationship, there is still a chibur. There is still an eternal connection, an eternal attachment to God. In the Beis HaMikdash, which was the external connection, where was there an internal connection? It couldn't be just a place of external connection. It was in the Kodesh Kadashim, the Holy of Holies, between the Kruvim, between those two angelic creatures. Those angelic forms that were made of gold that sat on top of the Aron, from which the divine presence emanated into the world. Our rabbis tell us that whenever the Jews were following the way of God, they would be embracing each other in love. And whenever the Jews were distanced from God, they would turn away from each other. It was a barometer, the mirror of what was going on in the Jewish people. On the day of the Churban, the day of the destructions, when the Romans came into the temple and they flung aside the curtain, there they saw the two Kruvim, the two angelic creatures, embracing each other. I want us to wonder, if we say that they embrace each other when we're following God's way, the day of the destruction of the temple was the day, the greatest day of a manifestation of our distancing ourselves from God. Why would those Kruvim have been hugging each other? Which was an indication of the fact that God was pleased with us. Because the Kruvim hugging each other sent another message. That God wanted us to understand that now it was a moment of churban, of charav. Now it was a moment of destruction. But understand that there is still a chibur. There is still an attachment, an eternal relationship which will remain intact forever. You know, when Avram Avinu bought the Cave of the Patriarchs, he bought it with money. Our rabbis in Tractate Kiddushin say, how do we know that a woman can be acquired with money, that a marriage can be founded on money? That you give money, today a ring, and you say, behold, you are betrothed to me with this ring. How do we know that it can be done with money? And our rabbis say we know because of when Abraham bought the Cave of the Patriarchs. Because it says there the word kach, take, and it says by marriage the word kach, take. Kicha misteyefron, we make what's called a gezerah shava. We make a connection between the purchase of the Cave of the Patriarchs and marriage. Now that opens up to a lot of nasty jokes. What in the world is the connection between marriage and between burial? Marriage, we know, is not only an external bond, but it's also an internal bond. And therefore, it is an eternal bond between those two souls. And that's why we bless a couple that they should build a binyan adeyad, a binyan for eternity, that death can't separate, that divorce can't completely disrupt. The connection is an internal, eternal connection. And therefore, it's only appropriate to connect marriage to Ma'aras Machpelah, to learn the foundation of marriage from the purchase of the Ma'aras Machpelah, because Ma'aras Machpelah is an expression of that eternal union of souls, which parallels the eternal union of Klal Yisrael, of the Jewish people, that is represented in that place in the Ma'aras Machpelah. That's why Avram Avinu met that place on the day that he was being given the besura, the news that he was going to have a child. Because having a child was what gave Avram Avinu eternity. And on the day that he was getting the message of eternity, he was shown his place in eternity. He was shown Ma'aras Machpelah, which was the reflection, it was the manifestation of God's eternal relationship with the Jewish people. That's why Dovid Hamlechs had to begin in the city of Chevron, because Dovid Hamlech's reign is an eternal reign. And therefore, it had to begin in the city of eternity to send the message to Dovid Hamlechs that Dovid Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayom, that Dovid Hamlechs lives forever, he's eternal. His kingdom is eternal because our bond with God is eternal. And that's why Calev went to Chevron, not to Yerushalayim, to daven, because he needed to tap into the schus, to the merit of that eternal bond between God and the Jewish people. The Meraglim were at that moment laying the foundations of Churban, of destruction. They came back on the 8th of Av, and on the 9th of Av, they told over the story to the Jews. They frightened them, and the Jewish people were filled with tears and crying. They gave up hope at that moment. And God said to them, tonight you cried for nothing. Every year on this night is going to be, you're going to cry on this night. And it was the Tisha B'Av, it was the 9th of Av. They were laying the foundations of Churban, of destruction, and therefore Calev had to establish the foundations of Chibur, of connection. To undo that Churban is only going to come from our understanding that our connection is eternal. And that bond can never and will never be broken. And that's why the city of Chevron is so critical to our existence as Jews, because it is the beacon, it is the message, it is the reminder that the Jewish people will never falter, that we will remain eternal. And we tap into that every day in our tefillos. Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. As we mention the Avos and we bring them alive in our lives, we connect ourselves to the city of Chevron, which is the Makom HaChibur, the place of attachment. The place of attachment of the Jews to God. Yerushalayim reminds us in a physical sense that we have this connection. We have to build it in a physical sense. Chevron reminds us that we need to strengthen and we need to rely on this internal, eternal connection to God. And that's the power that Chevron plays inside of our lives. I can't imagine what's going to be this year in Chevron. I only know last year we had just made Aliyah. 2 weeks later, it was Parsha Chayei, and we went to Chevron for Shabbos. That in itself is the whole story. But you see with your eyes the chibur, the attachment, tens of thousands of Jews just wanting to reconnect and reestablish that sense of eternity, that sense of eternal connection to God and to the Jewish nation. In this week's Parsha, when we read about Avraham Avinu establishing the Ma'aras Machpelah and establishing Chevron, we should feel inside of us, during a time where one could slip into despondency, during a time when one can slip into a sense of disconnection from God. You know, I hate to get political, and I'm going to try to present it in a non-political kind of way, but many Jews on both sides of the camp, but we're looking towards Trump and his great love of his great benevolence to the Jewish people, moving the embassy, establishing the state of Israel as the place of the Jew, not just Jerusalem. This is something that just happened 2 weeks ago, last week. Of all of the kindnesses that he did for the Jewish people, and that we were looking for that to continue on. And it's not going to in that way. It doesn't mean that it won't continue. It doesn't mean that the blessings won't continue in his life and in ours. But it's not going to continue the way it was. And we falter a little bit. We're a little worried, a little nervous of what the future is going to bring. And then we'd speak about Chevron. We speak about the chibur, the eternal attachment to God, and from God to the Jewish people. And we're given the strength and the encouragement and the power to pick ourselves up and not to worry about who's going to be at the driver's seat in the White House, not to worry about the things that are happening around us that drag us down, but to focus on that eternal connection and promise from God. This city is Chevron. It's a chibur. We have an everlasting attachment. You might not always be able to see it with your eyes, but if you open your mouths in prayer, you'll always be able to feel it in your hearts. My thoughts.